Welcome back to the deep dive. If you want a masterclass in how swiftly a nation can, well, shift its entire identity, today's topic is definitely it. We are diving into the Spanish-American War of 1898. It was a short, pretty decisive conflict, but it didn't just win a war. It fundamentally redrew America's global map and, interestingly, sparked a constitutional crisis that, we're still kind of grappling with today.
Absolutely. This is really the moment where the United States officially declared its isolationist era over, at least for a while. Our sources detail the quick military action, sure, but crucially, how it launched the U.S. straight into what they call the imperial game,
Right into it.
resulting in the rapid acquisition of territories across the Caribbean and the Pacific. So our mission today is really to understand the lasting consequences of this sudden step onto the world stage.
And what strikes you immediately looking at the source material is that this wasn't just some spontaneous decision, was it?
No, not at all. This war was really the culmination of decades of internal pressures, both economic and ideological.
Decades building up.
Precisely. The conflict reflected this powerful transition. The U.S. was shifting toward a much more assertive global role in the late 19th century. There were these powerful, often unseen forces pushing the country toward expansion long before the first shot was even fired.
Okay, let's unpack those deeper catalysts then. Beyond just sort of national pride or ideology, the sources really highlight the economic push. Why did America suddenly feel this need to project power overseas?
Well, you basically had runaway industrial success hitting what people saw as a domestic ceiling. American industrial output was huge by then.
Right.
And politicians, industrialists, they felt they needed new markets to absorb all that surplus production. Overseas territories looked like, well, simply new places to sell goods. It was about ensuring continued economic growth.
So a commercial drive wrapped in a flag, essentially.
You could put it that way, yeah.
Yep.
It was definitely a major factor.
And ideologically, that commercial drive was given a kind of strategic framework by figures like Alfred Thayer Mahan. The narrative at home, as the sources point out, was that the traditional American frontier, the West, had closed. So where do you look next?
Exactly. You look overseas, and Mahan's influential naval theories provided a roadmap.
Tell us a bit about Mahan's thesis. It was quite groundbreaking at the time, wasn't it?
It really was. He argued that truly great nations required naval supremacy, and that meant having a modern steel fleet.
Okay.
But a fleet needs support. So it also meant having coaling stations, ports, strategically placed around the globe. That gave expansion a kind of concrete strategic checklist.
Makes sense. Control the sea lanes.
And controlling key choke points became vital, especially Cuba, sitting right there off the Florida coast. It was seen as absolutely critical for securing U.S. trade routes in the Caribbean.
So we've got economic demand, we've got strategic theory building up. But to actually mobilize a huge nation for war, you often need, well, public fury. And that brings us to what I find one of the most fascinating and, frankly, kind of appalling parts of this whole run-up, the role of yellow journalism.
Ah, yes, yellow journalism. It was sensationalism on steroids, basically. You had this intense newspaper circulation war going on, primarily between Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal.
And the goal was selling papers, right? Not necessarily reporting balanced facts.
Absolutely. They extensively exaggerated Spanish atrocities during Cuba's independence struggle. That conflict had been grinding on since 1895, and it was brutal, but the papers amplified it for effect.
They really manufactured this perception, didn't they, that U.S. intervention wasn't just a strategic option, but a kind of moral imperative, a rescue mission for the Cubans.
Precisely. And our reading highlights that classic anecdote about Hearst. When the artist Frederick Remington, whom Hearst had sent to Cuba, telegraphed back saying things were quiet and there was no war to illustrate.
Yeah.
Hearst supposedly cabled back something like, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." Now, whether he actually said that verbatim is debated, but it captures the spirit perfectly.
Wow. That really tells you something about the power the press wielded. They created this incredibly explosive atmosphere.
They did. And that atmosphere met its spark with the USS Maine incident in February 1898.
Right, the Maine. A U.S. battleship just explodes suddenly in Havana Harbor. Over 200 American sailors killed.
The huge shock. And the critical thing here is that before any proper investigation could conclude what happened, and later evidence strongly suggested it was an internal accident, likely a coal bunker fire.
Before any of that came out.
Hearst and Pulitzer were already running these massive headlines screaming, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," blaming Spain immediately, without proof.
Just fanning the flames.
Exactly. Those inflammatory headlines effectively cornered President William McKinley.
Mhm.
He was under immense pressure from the public, from Congress. Jingoism was running wild.
So he issues an ultimatum.
He did. Spain must withdraw from Cuba. Spain refused, naturally, seeing it as an infringement on their sovereignty. Relations were severed, and within weeks, Congress declared war.
It's just astonishing how fast those dominoes fell. The explosion, the headlines, the ultimatum, the war declaration, all in a matter of months.
It really was incredibly swift.
And the actual fighting itself, April to August 1898, was, as we said, brief and decisive. The U.S. Navy in particular performed very well against the older Spanish fleets.
Yes, swift victories in places like Manila Bay and Santiago de Cuba. The Spanish forces were really quite weak by this point, overextended.
But the consequences, as we've noted, were just immense, far outstripping the scale of the actual conflict. This is where the U.S. really leaps into a completely new geopolitical category.
Absolutely. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, officially ended the conflict. But it wasn't just a peace treaty. It was basically an imperial shopping list.
Huh. Good way to put it.
It transferred major territories from Spain to U.S. control, giving the U.S. this far-flung colonial presence suddenly in both the Caribbean and the Pacific.
Okay, let's break down those acquisitions. Starting in the Caribbean, Cuba. Well, Cuba ostensibly gained independence, but that word came with some pretty significant strings attached, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Major strings. Cuban independence was immediately curtailed by the Platt Amendment. This was something the U.S. insisted be written into the new Cuban Constitution.
Forced into their constitution.
Essentially, yes. It ensured the U.S. retained the right to intervene militarily in Cuba to protect U.S. life, property, and Cuban independence, ironically.
Right.
And perhaps most famously, it secured the U.S. a permanent lease for naval stations, which is how we still have Guantanamo Bay today.
So it wasn't formal annexation, but it was certainly control. Our source calls it empire-light.
That's a good description. The U.S. achieved strategic control without the burdens of direct rule, at least initially.
But right next door, Puerto Rico's story was different. It was acquired directly via the treaty, becoming an unincorporated U.S. territory, and this immediately raised a really thorny legal question. Did the Constitution follow the flag?
Yes. That is the absolute core constitutional conflict kicked off by this war. When the U.S. acquired Puerto Rico, and the Philippines too, Congress had to figure out how to govern them. They set up civil governments through laws like the Four-Acre Act of 1900 for Puerto Rico.
But the fundamental question remained.
Were the people living in these territories entitled to the full rights and protections of U.S. citizens under the Constitution? Or could they be ruled essentially as subjects in a colony? It was a profound question for a nation founded on consent of the governed.
So the core issue was, can the U.S. actually own colonies without granting the inhabitants the full rights of American citizens? Did the structures of American democracy allow for that?
Exactly. And the answer, somewhat controversially, came through a series of Supreme Court decisions known collectively as the Insular Cases, starting around 1901.
The Insular Cases. Okay.
Yeah. This legal framework established the doctrine that, no, the Constitution does not automatically follow the flag in its entirety. It created this new category of unincorporated territory. Meaning residents were entitled to certain fundamental rights, but not all constitutional protections automatically applied. Congress could decide which rights extended to these territories. It was a novel, you might say, custom-built legal structure.
Basically invented to allow for empire.
That's how many historians see it, yes. It provided the legal justification necessary for running an empire without extending full citizenship or the promise of statehood.
That is just a crucial piece of this. The war literally forced the U.S. to invent a new legal status, a new class of subject population, just to justify holding on to these territories.
It did. And that need for, well, strategic control and the legal framework to support it really dictated the rest of the acquisitions, too. If we connect this back to Mahan's naval strategy...
the move into the Pacific starts to make perfect sense.
Exactly. Guam was seized during the war, became an immediate key naval refueling station halfway across the Pacific.
And Hawaii, it wasn't part of the Spanish treaty, but it gets annexed right around this time too, 1898.
Right. The U.S. had overthrown the Hawaiian monarchy back in 1893, but annexation was controversial. The strategic momentum from acquiring the Philippines really pushed the formal annexation of Hawaii over the line. It completed the strategic chain across the Pacific.
A chain leading straight to
the Philippines, ceded by Spain for a payment of $20 million. This was seen as the crown jewel by many expansionists.
Why the Philippines specifically?
Purely strategic and commercial advantage. It put the U.S. right on the doorstep of the vast Asian markets, particularly China. It was about being a major player in the Pacific Century that many foresaw.
But the Philippines quickly turned into the biggest moral and military headache for the U.S. government, didn't it?
Without a doubt. This became the most controversial outcome of the war. Filipino nationalists, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, had actually allied with the Americans against the Spanish.
They thought the U.S. was liberating them.
They absolutely expected independence. So the bitter realization that they had simply traded one imperial master, Spain, for another, the U.S., led immediately to conflict.
The Philippine-American War.
Yes, which officially lasted from 1899 to 1902, though resistance continued for years after. Aguinaldo launched this fierce guerrilla resistance against U.S. rule.
And this wasn't some quick cleanup operation, was it? The sources describe a brutal conflict.
It was incredibly brutal. The U.S. employed harsh tactics, including things like establishing reconcentration camps, similar to what the Spanish had done in Cuba, which the U.S. press had previously condemned. Civilian casualties were very high.
And this sparked a huge debate back home.
A massive moral debate. It fueled the rise of the Anti-Imperialist League. You had prominent figures like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, arguing passionately that subjugating the Filipinos betrayed America's own founding ideals of liberty and self-governance. It was a direct challenge to the nation's conscience. Could a republic be an empire?
So you see how rapidly U.S. global policy had to evolve just to manage and protect these new, far-flung possessions, having reached Asia's doorstep with the Philippines.
The immediate next step was securing economic access to the biggest prize,
Yeah.
China.
Right. The open door policy.
Exactly. Secretary of State John Hay steps in. The problem was the major European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, were already busy carving China up into exclusive spheres of influence.
Locking the U.S. out.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Threatening to lock out American commerce. So Hay issued the Open Door Note in 1899.
What did it actually ask for?
It essentially requested that all these foreign powers agree to respect equal trading rights within their spheres. No discrimination against other nations' businesses, maintain Chinese tariffs, that sort of thing. Keep the door open for everyone, including the U.S.
Did it work? Did they agree?
Well, it's complicated. The European powers gave these sort of evasive, non-committal replies. Nobody formally rejected it outright, though. So Hay cleverly declared victory, announcing that the principle had been accepted.
Diplomatic maneuvering.
Very much so. It allowed the U.S. to assert its commercial interests in China and justify the strategic value of its new Pacific acquisitions, like the Philippines.
Okay, so if we try to connect all these threads, zoom out to the bigger picture, the Spanish-American War wasn't just a military victory. It marks this permanent, irreversible transformation for the U.S.
Absolutely. It cemented the transition away from perceived isolationism towards global interventionism. This is the moment the U.S. really steps onto the world stage, joining the ranks of the established European empires.
Tramping out onto the world stage, as one historian put it.
Right, and transforming the global balance of power in the process. But this rapid expansion, as we discussed, immediately created that intense division back home.
The fight over the soul of the nation.
A genuine fight. Imperialism versus anti-imperialism. Deep questions about morality, democracy, national identity versus the perceived necessities of economic growth and strategic power.
And those foundational constitutional issues, the ones raised by governing these new territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, particularly the questions about citizenship, race, and rights under those insular cases, they aren't just historical footnotes, are they?
Not at all. They fundamentally define the relationship between Washington and its territories. And that legal framework, that status of unincorporated territory, continues to shape the lives and political realities of people in places like Puerto Rico and Guam today. The debates are ongoing.
The fundamental shift seems so profound. Before 1898, when the U.S. expanded across the continent, the assumption was always eventual statehood, full constitutional equality.
That was the model, yes. The Northwest Ordinance model.
But after 1898, the U.S. essentially invents a way to rule populations without granting them that promise. It really does raise that provocative question you mentioned earlier. How much did the pursuit of global empire force the U.S. to redefine its own most cherished democratic ideals?
It's a critical question.
So if we summarize this whole journey, we went from yellow journalists basically manufacturing outrage over the U.S. Maine to a military conflict that lasted just about 4 months.
A splendid little war, as John Hay called it.
Right. resulting in this vast territorial sweep across the Caribbean and the Pacific. The U.S. went from being seen as maybe an isolationist continental power to a full-blown global empire almost overnight. It's a textbook example of how a brief conflict can have these monumental, lasting geopolitical consequences.
Indeed. And as you, the listener, reflect on this, maybe remember that the war's most critical legacy isn't just the map changing, the geography. It's the legal and philosophical innovation it required. Those insular cases, the debates over governance, citizenship, race, they immediately tested America's commitment to self-determination and democracy at the dawn of the 20th century. And perhaps a final thought to leave you with is this. Consider how that very specific debate, created over a century ago, about who counts as an American citizen in an unincorporated territory, how that's still shaping policy, identity, and fundamental rights today. It's not just history, it's present.